April 1st, 1970, Camp Dak Seang, Central Highlands, Vietnam. Sergeant Gary Beikirch crouched beside a wounded American officer, lying in exposed ground. Mortar rounds hammered positions across the Special Forces compound. 22 years old, trained as a Green Beret medic. Beikirch had been treating casualties since the North Vietnamese assault began at dawn. His hands worked quickly applying field dressings, while automatic weapons fire raked the perimeter. But something was wrong with his own body. His legs wouldn't respond properly. Movement felt strange, disconnected. Minutes earlier, a mortar round had exploded 20 feet away, throwing him into sandbags with force that felt like being kicked by a horse. Shrapnel had struck near his spine. He could feel the wound bleeding through his uniform, knew the damage was serious. Yet when he looked down at his legs, they appeared intact. They simply wouldn't obey commands to stand. Beikirch tested his arms. They worked. He could crawl. 15-year-old Deo, his Montagnard bodyguard and friend who had been learning English from him, crawled to his side, despite being wounded in the same blast. Together they began dragging themselves across open ground toward the next casualty, Beikirch's medical bag in one hand, the other pulling him forward through dirt as rounds impacted around them. What the North Vietnamese forces surrounding Camp Dak Seang didn't know was that the young medic they had partially paralyzed would spend the next 12 hours crawling from wounded man to wounded man. Treating casualties he couldn't walk to reach, being shot twice more while performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and dragging soldiers to safety, proving that courage isn't measured by what your body can do, but by what you refuse to stop doing, even when your body fails and friends die shielding you from rockets. The attack began at first light on April 1st, 1970, when North Vietnamese infantry from the 28th Regiment opened fire from positions surrounding Camp Dak Seang. Mortars and recoilless rifles hammered the compound with coordinated barrage. That destroyed communications equipment, collapsed portions of defensive bunkers, and killed 3 Montagnard defenders within the first minutes. Sergeant Gary Beikirch had been awake for the early patrol rotation when the first explosions erupted across the perimeter. He grabbed his medical bag and sprinted toward the nearest casualty, a wounded American sergeant screaming from position near the eastern wire. Automatic weapons fire raked the compound. Beikirch moved through chaos with focus developed through months, serving as both combat medic and village physician. To the Montagnard people, Camp Dak Seang occupied strategic position in the Dak Poco Valley, 10 kilometers from the Laotian border and 64 kilometers northwest of Kontum. The isolated compound sat astride infiltration routes the North Vietnamese desperately needed to funnel troops and supplies from the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the Central Highlands. For months, the 12 Green Berets of detachment A245 and 450, Montagnard CIDG forces had interdicted these supply lines. Through aggressive patrolling and intelligence gathering, the North Vietnamese had attempted to overrun the camp once before in August 1968, employing the 101D Regiment supported by artillery. That attack had been beaten back through concentrated defensive fire. But this assault was different. Intelligence indicated elements of an entire division had positioned themselves in the mountains surrounding Dak Seang. 3 regiments of infantry supported by the 40th Artillery Regiment, equipped with heavy weapons capable of reducing fortifications to rubble. Beikirch reached the wounded sergeant and dropped beside him, assessing injuries while mortar rounds continued impacting across the compound. Field dressing applied, morphine administered, airways checked. The sergeant would survive if evacuated quickly. Beikirch called for litter bearers and moved toward the next casualty, a Montagnard fighter who had taken shrapnel through the chest. The wounded man recognized Beikirch immediately. the American medic who had treated his daughter's fever 3 weeks earlier, who spoke Vietnamese well enough to joke with villagers, who understood that serving the Montagnard people meant being present for births and illnesses and festivals, not just combat. This dual role created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Special Forces medics weren't just soldiers who happened to possess medical training. They were physicians who lived among indigenous populations, treating 100 patients weekly in makeshift clinics while maintaining combat readiness. They delivered babies, performed emergency surgery, extracted teeth, and vaccinated children against disease. When combat came, these same medics treated soldiers they had served as doctor, watching friends die despite medical care administered under fire. Beikirch stabilized the Montagnard fighter and moved to treat the American officer who lay exposed near the command bunker. Captain Paul Landers, the 25-year-old A-team leader, had been directing defensive fire when mortar fragments struck his leg. Beikirch crawled across open ground as rounds impacted around him, reached the captain, and began applying pressure dressings. The wound was serious but manageable. Landers refused evacuation, insisting on remaining at command position. Beikirch understood. Officers don't abandon posts during siege. He finished treatment and prepared to move the captain to aid station when he heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar round. The explosion 20 feet away felt like being kicked by a horse. Beikirch flew backward into sandbags with force that drove air from lungs and sent shock through entire body. For several seconds he couldn't process what had happened. Then came the pain, burning sensation across back, and realization that something was seriously wrong. He attempted to stand. His legs wouldn't respond. They looked intact, no visible catastrophic damage. Yet they simply wouldn't obey commands. Shrapnel had struck near his spine, partially severing neural connections that controlled lower body movement. Beikirch tested his arms. They worked. He could crawl. And 15-year-old Deo, his Montagnard bodyguard who had been learning English from conversations shared during quiet evenings, crawled to his side, despite being wounded in the same blast, proving that some bonds transcend language and culture and military rank, and that 12 hours of unprecedented courage were just beginning. Beikirch understood immediately what the paralysis meant. His medical training told him shrapnel had severed or damaged spinal nerves controlling lower body function. Without immediate surgery and stabilization, the injury could worsen. Military doctrine demanded wounded medics accept treatment and evacuation, so others could assume medical duties. But Beikirch looked across the compound and counted at least a dozen wounded men visible from his position. More casualties were certainly scattered throughout defensive positions. The 12 Green Berets at Camp Dak Seang included engineers, weapons specialists, and intelligence operatives, none trained to perform emergency surgery or treat traumatic battlefield injuries. Beikirch was the only Special Forces medic present, making him irreplaceable during siege that could last days. Special Forces medics received the most comprehensive medical training in the United States military. The 18-week course at Fort Sam Houston taught emergency trauma care, preventive medicine, dental procedures, basic veterinary medicine, and emergency surgical techniques. Regular Army medics trained 8 to 10 weeks and focused on immediate battlefield casualty treatment. SF medics learned to function as sole medical professionals in remote camps, where helicopter evacuation might be impossible for days. They performed appendectomies using field equipment. They extracted teeth, delivered babies, treated tuberculosis and malaria, vaccinated entire villages against disease. In camps like Dak Seang, positioned 10 kilometers from Laotian border along enemy infiltration routes, the SF medic served dual role as combat medic for American and CIDG forces and village physician for Montagnard population. Beikirch had treated 100 patients weekly during months at Dak Seang, setting broken bones, diagnosing illnesses, providing prenatal care, performing minor surgery. Losing him during siege meant wounded soldiers would die from injuries that proper medical care could prevent. 15-year-old Deo crawled to Beikirch's position, despite being wounded in the same mortar blast that had paralyzed the American medic. The young Montagnard had been assigned as bodyguard when Beikirch arrived at Dak Seang in July 1969. Over 9 months, their relationship had evolved from military necessity into friendship that transcended language and culture. Beikirch had been teaching Deo English during quiet evenings between patrols. Deo had been teaching Beikirch deeper understanding of Montagnard customs and beliefs. Now the teenager who couldn't stand watched the medic who couldn't walk, and both understood without speaking that casualties needed treatment, regardless of their own injuries. Together they began crawling across open ground, Beikirch dragging medical bag with one hand, while pulling himself forward with the other, Deo moving beside him, distributing supplies and helping stabilize wounded soldiers. They reached a critically injured Vietnamese fighter who had stopped breathing. Beikirch positioned himself and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, while simultaneously dragging the soldier toward aid station, breathing for him, pulling both their weights across dirt, exposing himself to concentrated fire for seconds that felt like minutes. A round struck Beikirch in the side, tearing through tissue and creating new source of bleeding. The impact knocked him sideways but didn't stop his movement. He continued resuscitation and evacuation, got the soldier to aid station where others could provide continued treatment, then crawled back toward the perimeter where more casualties waited. Deo remained beside him despite his own wounds, the young bodyguard now protecting through presence rather than firepower, proving that courage sometimes means crawling through kill zones when standing becomes impossible. They treated 6 more casualties over the next hour, each requiring different medical response. Field dressings applied to control bleeding, morphine administered to manage shock and pain, airways cleared to prevent suffocation, tourniquets tightened to stop arterial blood loss. Beikirch worked from positions of complete vulnerability, lying flat or propped on elbows, unable to seek cover when fire intensified, dependent on luck and enemy marksmanship errors for survival. His medical training allowed him to assess and treat injuries despite physical limitations. His commitment to the medic's code, treating wounded regardless of personal risk, kept him functioning, despite injuries that justified evacuation, and the bond with Deo, forged through months of shared duty and mutual respect, created partnership that functioned, despite neither being physically whole. But as they crawled toward another casualty near the eastern perimeter, Beikirch heard the distinctive whistle of incoming rocket, louder than mortar rounds, more sustained than rifle fire, the sound that gave defenders perhaps 2 seconds warning before impact and explosion that could kill everyone within blast radius. Deo reacted with speed that came from instinct rather than thought. The 15-year-old instantly set Beikirch down and threw his body on top of the paralyzed medic, covering him completely. The rocket exploded within feet of their position. Blast concussion rolled across ground in wave that lifted dirt and debris. Shrapnel screamed through air in patterns that shredded everything in its path. When the noise stopped and dust began settling, Beikirch opened his eyes. Deo didn't. The young Montagnard lay motionless across him. Body-absorbing impacts meant for the American medic he had been assigned to protect 9 months earlier. The relationship between Special Forces soldiers and Montagnard people represented unique bond in American military history. Green Berets lived among indigenous populations rather than establishing separate compounds. They learned local languages, participated in village ceremonies, respected cultural traditions that regular forces often dismissed. SF medics like Beikirch served dual role, combat medic for American and CIDG forces, village physician for Montagnard families. This created relationships that transcended normal military duty. Beikirch had treated Deo's relatives for illnesses, delivered babies in the village, vaccinated children against disease. Deo had been teaching him Montagnard customs and beliefs, while learning English from the American medic. Their bond wasn't just bodyguard and principal, it was friendship forged through months of shared purpose and mutual respect. The Montagnard people had long history of fierce loyalty to those who honored them. Deo's sacrifice proved that loyalty could mean instant choice to die so someone else could live. Beikirch called for help. Other hands pulled Deo's body away, and the medic realized his friend's sacrifice had saved his life. The wounds he himself sustained from the blast were relatively minor, compared to what direct impact would have inflicted. Deo had absorbed the shrapnel meant for both of them. Beikirch could continue treating casualties. Because a 15-year-old who had been learning English phrases and teaching Vietnamese words had decided in split second that the American medic's life was worth more than his own. The mathematics were impossible to process. Deo dead so Beikirch could save others. Young bodyguard becoming final casualty he could never treat. Friendship ending in sacrifice that permitted mission to continue. But more wounded men were screaming for help across the compound. Beikirch had been shot in the side earlier during mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The rocket blast had added new injuries. He was now paralyzed from waist down, bleeding from multiple wounds, and had lost the companion who had been crawling beside him. Yet, his medical training told him that casualties without treatment would die. And he remained the only Special Forces medic at Camp Dak Seang. He tried to crawl. His arms barely functioned from blood loss and exhaustion. Montagnard villagers saw him struggling and understood. They picked him up and carried him from position to position, setting him down beside wounded soldiers so he could provide treatment, then carrying him to the next casualty. Beikirch worked from wherever they placed him, applying field dressings, administering morphine, clearing airways, offering words of encouragement in Vietnamese to fighters who recognized the American doctor who wouldn't quit, despite injuries that should have killed him, and loss that should have broken him. Hours passed in this manner, villagers carrying the medic who couldn't walk, Beikirch treating soldiers he couldn't reach on his own, the siege continuing with intensity that showed no sign of ending, and casualty count mounting despite defensive fire. That had so far prevented complete overrun of the camp. The loss of a Special Forces medic during siege created cascade of suffering. That extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties. Camp Dak Seang housed 12 Green Berets from Detachment A-245, 450 Montagnard CIDG fighters, and about 700 civilian dependents, villagers who sought protection within compound walls when North Vietnamese forces surrounded the valley. Among those 12 Americans, only one possessed medical training comprehensive enough to perform emergency surgery, treat traumatic battlefield injuries, and manage preventive medicine for entire population. If Beikirch died or became completely incapacitated, wounded soldiers would die from injuries that proper medical care could prevent. Villagers would lack treatment for diseases and injuries that occurred even during siege. The burden of casualty care would fall on soldiers trained for combat rather than medicine, creating a situation where evacuation became only option for injuries that field treatment could manage. Special Forces medics received most comprehensive medical training in United States military. The 18-week Special Forces Medical Sergeant course at Fort Sam Houston, Texas taught skills that regular Army medics never learned. Standard Army combat medic training lasted 8 to 10 weeks and focused on immediate battlefield casualty treatment, controlling bleeding, managing shock, stabilizing airways, administering morphine. SF medics learned those skills as foundation, then progressed to advanced trauma care, emergency surgical procedures, dental extraction and treatment, preventive medicine, basic veterinary care for animals that indigenous populations depended upon, and diagnosis and treatment of tropical diseases. The curriculum included hands-on surgical practice, often using pigs to simulate human anatomy. Graduates could perform appendectomies, treat gunshot wounds requiring surgery, deliver babies, extract teeth, diagnose malaria and tuberculosis, vaccinate against disease, and manage field hospitals with equipment that arrived in several footlockers. In remote camps positioned along enemy infiltration routes, Special Forces medics served dual role that created bonds transcending normal military relationships. They functioned as combat medics for American and CIDG forces during operations and engagements. Simultaneously, they operated as village physicians for Montagnard populations, treating 100 patients weekly during peacetime periods, setting broken bones, diagnosing illnesses, providing prenatal care, performing minor surgery, teaching hygiene and sanitation practices that prevented disease spread. This dual role meant SF medics like Beikirch weren't just soldiers who happened to possess medical training. They were physicians who lived among indigenous populations for months, participating in village ceremonies, learning local languages, respecting cultural traditions. The Montagnard people came to trust them, not just as military allies, but as healers who cared for their families. When combat came, these same medics treated soldiers they had served as doctor, watching patients become casualties, friends become wounded, children they had vaccinated die from injuries sustained defending camps. Beikirch embodied this intersection of warrior and healer perfectly. He had arrived at Dak Seang in July 1969 and spent 9 months serving the Montagnard population. He learned Vietnamese to communicate with patients, conducted daily sick calls treating dozens of villagers, delivered babies, vaccinated children, taught preventive medicine that saved lives through disease prevention rather than emergency treatment. When patrols departed camp, he accompanied them as combat medic ready to treat battlefield casualties. When North Vietnamese forces probed perimeter defenses, he returned fire alongside other defenders while maintaining medical readiness. This duality created unique moral burden. Physicians who bonded with villagers as patients, then watched them die as soldiers. Healers who measured success in lives saved, but operated in environment designed for killing. Medics whose commitment to saving lives meant accepting that they would witness deaths they couldn't prevent, despite comprehensive training and maximum effort. But Beikirch's extensive medical training meant he understood exactly how catastrophic his injuries were on April 1st, 1970. The shrapnel wound near his spine had caused partial paralysis through nerve damage that might be permanent. The gunshot to his side had created internal bleeding. That required surgical intervention he couldn't provide himself. Blood loss from multiple wounds was causing shock. That would eventually render him unconscious. Yet, he continued treating casualties, because his training told him that wounded men without proper medical care would die, and he remained the only person at Camp Dak Seang capable of providing that care, regardless of his own condition, proving that sometimes the medic's code demands functioning until death or unconsciousness makes continuation physically impossible, and that comprehensive training creates burden of knowledge, understanding exactly how injured you are, while refusing to stop because others need skills only you possess. Hour after hour on April 1st, 1970, Beikirch continued treating wounded. Despite paralysis and gunshot wounds that should have rendered him unconscious, when his arms no longer possessed strength to crawl, Montagnard villagers carried him from casualty to casualty. They would lift him, move him to the next wounded soldier, set him down gently, and retreat to cover while he worked. The medic would assess injuries from whatever position they placed him, lying flat, propped against sandbags, or supported by other soldiers. Field dressings applied to control bleeding, morphine administered to manage pain and shock, tourniquets tightened to prevent arterial blood loss, airways cleared to maintain breathing. Each casualty received treatment that addressed immediate life-threatening injuries, buying time for eventual evacuation to surgical facilities. Between treating wounded, Beikirch exchanged fire with enemy forces. Even paralyzed medic remained combatant when necessary. Vietnam represented first American conflict where medics routinely carried weapons and participated in combat operations. The Geneva Convention prohibited targeting medical personnel, but North Vietnamese forces routinely ignored these protections. SF medics trained with M16 rifles, 45 caliber pistols, and grenades alongside medical equipment. When enemy positions threatened casualties he was treating, Beikirch returned fire while simultaneously applying medical care. The duality was absolute. Healer and warrior, physician and soldier, medic who saved lives while taking others when tactical situation demanded both roles simultaneously. The siege of Dak Seang lasted 37 days total, but April 1st represented most intense fighting and highest casualty count. North Vietnamese forces from the 28th Regiment, supported by 40th Artillery Regiment, attempted to overrun the compound. Through coordinated assault that began at dawn and continued throughout day, mortar and recoilless rifle fire hammered defensive positions. Infantry attacks probed perimeter at multiple points. The 12 Green Berets and 450 Montagnard defenders faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage, but superior defensive positions and concentrated firepower prevented breakthrough. Air support from helicopter gunships and fixed-wing aircraft provided devastating fire against enemy positions when weather permitted. Artillery support from fire support bases delivered precise strikes on enemy concentrations, yet the siege would continue for over a month, with daily casualties requiring medical treatment that only Beikirch could provide. As afternoon approached, Beikirch's condition deteriorated beyond what Will could overcome. Blood loss from multiple wounds caused shock that manifested in confusion, cold skin, rapid pulse, and dropping blood pressure. The shrapnel wound near his spine had created swelling that worsened paralysis. Internal bleeding from the gunshot to his side required surgical intervention. He couldn't provide himself. His vision blurred. His hands shook uncontrollably. Speech became difficult. Yet he continued treating casualties, because wounded soldiers needed medical care, and he remained the only person at Camp Dak Seang capable of providing it. The medic's code, treating wounded regardless of personal risk, reached ultimate expression, when medic who couldn't walk continued working for 12 hours until physical collapse made continuation impossible. Finally, about 12 hours after the attack began, Beikirch lost consciousness while treating a wounded Montagnard fighter. Only then did other defenders carry him to aid station and prepare for evacuation. The medic, who had refused treatment throughout the day while caring for dozens of casualties, finally permitted himself to become patient. His injuries were catastrophic: partial paralysis from spinal trauma, gunshot wound causing internal bleeding, multiple shrapnel wounds, severe blood loss, shock from sustained trauma. Helicopter evacuation to 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang began process of saving his life, but survival remained uncertain. As medical personnel who normally treated patients became patient requiring treatment, he had provided others throughout siege. That demonstrated courage sustained beyond human limits, proving that sometimes heroism means functioning until body fails completely, rather than accepting limitations that would doom others to death when medical skills could prevent it. Beikirch arrived at the 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang unconscious from blood loss and shock. Doctors worked through the night stabilizing his condition, transfusions to replace blood volume, surgery to address internal bleeding from the gunshot wound, emergency treatment for spinal trauma. His survival remained uncertain for days, as medical teams fought cascading complications from multiple catastrophic injuries. The shrapnel wound near his spine had caused partial paralysis through nerve damage. The gunshot to his stomach had perforated organs requiring extensive surgical repair. Severe blood loss from 3 separate wounds had pushed his body into shock. Any single injury justified medical evacuation and extended treatment. Combined, they created a situation where survival itself represented remarkable outcome. Medical explanation of Beikirch's wounds documented extent of damage sustained during 12 hours treating casualties under fire. Shrapnel fragments had struck near his spine during first mortar blast, causing spinal cord concussion and partial paralysis from waist down. The gunshot wound to his side occurred while performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the round passing through tissue and creating internal bleeding. The final gunshot to his stomach happened hours into the siege. When he continued treating casualties despite previous injuries, doctors described survival as remarkable. Most patients with comparable trauma died from blood loss or shock before reaching surgical facilities. That Beikirch remained conscious and functional for 12 hours while sustaining these injuries defied medical understanding of human endurance. From Nha Trang, Beikirch was evacuated to Japan, then eventually to Valley Forge Medical Center in Pennsylvania. 6 months of rehabilitation followed. Painful physical therapy focused on regaining leg function, surgical procedures to address complications from spinal injury, psychological counseling for trauma sustained during siege. Through months of work, he slowly regained limited ability to walk. The paralysis partially receded as swelling decreased, and damaged nerves healed incompletely. He would never fully recover. His legs worked but not normally. Pain became constant companion. Physical limitations prevented return to Special Forces duty. The Army medically discharged him as sergeant in 1971. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through approval process during his recovery. Witness statements from survivors described 12 hours of unprecedented heroism. Medic who couldn't walk treating casualties by crawling, then being carried from position to position, refusing evacuation despite multiple wounds, continuing until physical collapse made continuation impossible. Command recommendations emphasized that Beikirch's actions saved dozens of lives that would have been lost without immediate medical treatment. On October 15, 1973, President Richard Nixon presented the Medal of Honor to Beikirch. At White House ceremony, recognizing courage that transcended human limitations and devotion to duty that persisted until unconsciousness forced cessation, but no medal could restore what was lost. Deo, the 15-year-old who had died shielding him from rocket blast, was gone. The Montagnard villages he had served as physician, vaccinating children, delivering babies, treating illnesses. Many had died as soldiers defending Camp Dak Seang. His body functioned but carried permanent damage from injuries sustained saving others. The question that haunted him wasn't whether courage had been recognized, but whether survival was justified when friends had died protecting him. The physical wounds partially healed through surgery and rehabilitation. The psychological wounds, survivors' guilt over Deo's sacrifice, trauma from watching patients become casualties, burden of recognition when others had died unrecognized. These proved harder to treat than spinal injuries or gunshot wounds, demonstrating that sometimes the hardest battle begins after combat ends, when heroes must survive not just physical damage, but moral weight of living when others died so they could. The years after Vietnam brought darkness that no medal could illuminate. Beikirch withdrew from society, haunted by questions that had no answers. Why had Deo died while he survived? Why had 15-year-old bodyguard sacrificed himself to shield medic from rocket blast? The mathematics seemed wrong. Young Montagnard, with entire life ahead, gave his so that wounded American could continue saving others. Survivor's guilt consumed him. Nightmares replayed the siege, crawling through kill zones, treating casualties he couldn't reach, watching Deo's body lifted away. PTSD manifested in hypervigilance, emotional numbness, inability to connect with people who hadn't experienced combat. He battled alcoholism and depression. For years, Beikirch lived in a cave in the mountains near Rochester, New York, isolating himself from world that celebrated his heroism, while he questioned whether survival itself was justified. Many Medal of Honor recipients struggled with post-war adjustment. The nation's highest military decoration brought expectations and attention that some recipients found overwhelming. They had acted from necessity during combat, doing what situation demanded rather than seeking recognition. Being called heroes felt wrong when friends had died performing equally courageous actions that went unrecognized. Some recipients felt unworthy of medal, believing they had simply done their jobs while others had sacrificed more. Others carried psychological burdens from combat that medals couldn't alleviate. Beikirch faced both challenges, feeling unworthy of recognition, while carrying trauma from 12 hours treating wounded while paralyzed, and guilt over Deo's sacrifice that had saved his life. Eventually, Beikirch found path out of darkness, through faith and recognition that honoring those who died meant living life of significance. He graduated from White Mountain Seminary with bachelor's degree and became ordained minister, dedicating himself to serving others as he had served soldiers and montagnard villagers at Dak Seang. He worked with at-risk youth who needed guidance, counseling those facing challenges similar to struggles he had overcome. His calling transformed from treating physical wounds during combat to healing broken lives in peacetime. The medic's code, serving others regardless of personal cost, found new expression through ministry. That proved service transcends circumstances. Beikirch travelled extensively speaking about his experiences, not to glorify war, but to honour those who had died and encourage others facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. This post-war journey demonstrated that true heroism sometimes means surviving when survival feels impossible, then choosing to live courageously despite psychological wounds that never completely heal. Beikirch spent decades serving others through ministry, proving that Deo's sacrifice and the 12 hours at Dak Seang weren't isolated events, but foundation for life dedicated to principle that others' needs outweigh personal comfort. He maintained relationships with veterans and montagnard refugees who had escaped Vietnam after war's conclusion, honouring bonds forged through shared combat and mutual respect. Gary Beikirch died December 24, 2021, at age 74. His name remains in Medal of Honor records. Alongside citation describing 12 hours of unprecedented courage, Deo's sacrifice is remembered through every speech Beikirch gave, every youth he counselled, every life he touched through ministry that extended medics' code from battlefield to broader service. The legacy isn't measured just in lives saved at Dak Seang on April 1, 1970, but in generations served afterward, through decades of ministry that proved heroism isn't single moment of courage, but commitment to living courageously every day after, serving others despite permanent injuries and psychological scars, and honouring those who died by ensuring their sacrifice inspired life of significance, rather than guilt-driven isolation. Beikirch's journey from cave to pulpit demonstrated that sometimes the hardest battle is surviving combat's aftermath, and choosing service over surrender when every instinct demands withdrawal, proving that the medic who couldn't walk but refused to quit during siege ultimately became minister who couldn't forget but refused to stop serving.